The BRICS countries, the original BRICS plus the new members of BRICS, are far away from having anything that can rival the dollar's dominance. A unified BRICS currency, Russia, India, China, Brazil getting together and sharing currency, that's not going to happen.
Can the BRICS countries challenge the dominance of the US dollar? Well, Russian President Vladimir Putin and his BRICS partners want to do just that. But is their goal realistic? Josh Lipsky, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's GeoEconomics Center, spoke to DW Business on the sidelines of this year's IMF World Bank Group annual meeting. He talks about whether the BRICS countries can come up with an alternative to the dollar and reshape global finance. Take a look.
Let's start in Russia, where Vladimir Putin, of course, is holding a BRICS summit. Now, he sees BRICS as on the path towards ending the dominance of the dollar. Is he right? Is there a path towards ending the dominance of the US dollar?
I think the short answer is no, but we should pay attention to what he's trying to do. So we are here at the IMF World Bank annual meetings, international multilateralism, economic policymaking. But as you say, there's another important global economic and global political event happening, the BRICS summit in Russia. And one of Putin's goals for this summit is to create alternatives to the dollar. Now, that is very complicated and hard to do, and the BRICS countries, the original BRICS plus the new members of BRICS, are far away from having anything that can rival the dollar's dominance. But what they're focused on is not an alternative currency as much as alternative payment systems. And that is important, because here we're not talking about a unified BRICS currency, Russia, India, China, Brazil getting together and sharing currency. That's not going to happen for a whole range of monetary and fiscal reasons. But is it possible that they could build bilateral channels to exchange rubles and yuan and rial between their banks and not use dollars? That is possible. In fact, our research at the Atlantic Council shows that's already happening. So that's the difference between payment systems and currency, and why we in the US and countries around the world should pay close attention to those ambitions.
And to what extent would you say that they're all on the same page when it comes to ending the dominance of the dollar or payment systems?
They're not on the same page. Their unifying principle is that they don't like something. They don't like reliance on the dollar, but there's no agreement on what they do like. Now, the question is, could they build a network that's similar to SWIFT or CHIPS, the way banks around the world communicate with each other now and transfer money? That would be very complicated, because the dollar is the lifeline, the liquidity of the global economic system, and there's no currency, even the Chinese yuan, that can come close to rivaling that now. So they agree on what they dislike, but they don't agree on what they like, and I think that's one of the many hurdles they face if they would ever try to challenge the dollar. But it's important to say, they don't want to replace the dollar. They just want to lessen the dollar's influence in the global economy. So the dollar share of global reserves has only dwindled slightly over the past 2 decades. The yuan has increased slightly, but there's still a huge gap, 50% to 4%. So if they can close that gap a little, then I think they see some success. So it's not about replacing as much as it might be challenging or ebbing some of the dominance.
Now, speaking of not being quite on the same page, India has said that it will not target the dollar. So why the difference in attitude from India in particular?
Well, India is a U.S. partner in many ways. I mean, compare India's bilateral relationship with the United States to Russia's relationship with the United States right now. Totally different geopolitically, trade partnership with India, economic partnership, diplomatic partnership, part of the Quad arrangement, national security arrangement the U.S. has that India is part of. So all of these are reasons that, I don't think India sees itself geopolitically in the same camp as Russia or even China. India would like to be part of the U.S. system, also part of the BRICS system. It doesn't want to be forced to choose, and that's one of the reasons I think they are far away from having any interest in doing a sort of alternative currency. They rely heavily on the dollar, as do economies around the world.
Now, you say they're far away, but have they made any progress towards challenging the dollar at all?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to note that since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we have shown at the Atlantic Council there's been a doubling of interest in wholesale central bank digital currency. And basically what that means is a way that banks can transfer money between themselves settle almost instantly and not touch dollars. Now, does that challenge the global role of the dollar? No, but it does potentially make it easier to evade sanctions. And so it's important to understand that there has been some progress made by China, Russia, and other countries in establishing bilateral channels. Even though these are small in scale, there are only many in pilot stage, they are making progress from where they were a year or 2 years ago. And US policymakers are aware of that, they're conscious of it, and they understand it can affect how we use the dollar in a national security role.
Now, speaking of alternative payment systems, are the Chinese any closer to getting an alternative to SWIFT?
They are closer, and they have a couple different options here. One is SIPS. This is their interbank system. It's important to note that SIPS, unlike SWIFT, is both a messaging and settlement system. So SWIFT messages. SWIFT is 50 years old. That was the best technology at the time, and then it's settled through a different network, usually chips. SIPS, China's program, it only has about 10% of the banks that SWIFT has online, but it does settlement and messaging at the same time. And that's grown significantly over the past year, so they're making progress there. They're also making progress on a project called mBridge. mBridge is a cross-border wholesale central bank digital currency program that connects the People's Bank of China, Hong Kong, Thailand, UAE, and recently Saudi Arabia. We think more countries will join this year. So the bottom line is they are making progress. This is low-scale volume, $10 million, $20 million. We're not talking about the global financial system like SWIFT is, but it's different than where it was a year or 2 years ago. And that's why I said at the beginning, it's important we pay attention to it.
Do they have a point? Is it good for one currency to be so dominant globally?
Well, that's an interesting question. It probably depends on your perspective and where you come from. You know, the dollar has been the world's reserve currency for almost a century now. I would argue that that has been broadly good for the global economy. It has created stability, we have rule of law, we don't have capital controls in this country so people can invest in and out. So the dollar has been an important lifeline to the global economy. It's provided critical liquidity when countries have needed it. It's been a stabilizing force for the global economy. Typically, it makes sense that there would be one dominant reserve currency. Could you live in a world of multipolarity where there are few reserve currencies? Is that better or worse? It depends on the country perspective, and it's a mix of not just macroeconomics, but national security. So from a US perspective, of course, the dollar is the world's reserve currency as a positive. Other countries may feel differently, but I bet if you ask most countries here at the IMF World Bank annual meetings, would they rather keep the dollar as the world reserve currency or have an alternative? My guess is most, but not all, would say we would keep the dollar as the world's reserve currency because it's a stabilizing force in the global economy.
Now, you've already answered this a little, but what are the biggest hurdles towards challenging the dollar in the way that these countries are trying to do?
Well, one of the biggest hurdles is liquidity, right? So the dollar is widely available, you can access it. This is what makes it part of the lifeblood of the global economy. No other currency, certainly not China's with its capital controls, can provide that sort of ample opportunity to get money when you need it, and that's why people go to dollars whenever they need it. So there's no currency that can challenge that. You also need rule of law in the country, right? So you can understand if there's a conflict, if there's a dispute, it's going to be litigated and settled in a fair way. The US provides that. You need stability in the fiscal house. Now, you could argue the US and other countries don't have enough stability in their fiscal house, giving rise to public debt, but comparatively, because of our ability to issue treasuries and the world's interest in buying treasuries, we have a very strong fiscal situation compared to other countries. And so all of those things makes the dollar very hard to challenge in the near term. There's just no viable alternative, but again, that doesn't mean we shouldn't pay attention for countries' interest in finding an alternative. That's important. We should take that seriously from a US perspective. Why are countries looking for alternatives to the dollar? What does that mean? And instead of just looking at what they're doing and saying we don't like that, we should reinvest in our systems in the United States. Upgrade and modernize the SWIFT system, for example, which, as I said, is 50 years old. That's the way we should approach this from a US perspective. Don't complain about what other countries are doing. Double down on your strength, which is still the dollar, which is still the global reserve currency by far.
And when you say it's important to look at why they're doing that and what does it mean, what is the answer?
Well, there are a lot of answers, and it depends on the country you speak to and their interest. I think one answer countries would give is the way the U.S. has used sanctions, especially over the past few years. They see that, and it makes them concerned from their perspective. What if the U.S. would disagree with something we did geopolitically, militarily? Could the dollar then be used, and would that hurt our economy? Do I, as a policymaker in a country, need to find an alternative? And that's why it's so important to understand it's not either or with the dollar. Countries need the dollar, they will use the dollar, but would they like to find some other kind of bypass around the dollar if they need it? I think that's one of the drivers of why countries are certainly exploring alternatives, especially in the last few years.
Now, I certainly don't want to skip over talking about why we're here today. Of course, we're at the annual meetings. The World Economic Outlook is something that the whole world looks at. How do you think the upcoming election in 2 weeks is going to change that outlook?
Yeah, well, that is the big question for this week. It's certainly what everyone's chatting about here, even though it's not on the official agenda. I think for purposes of the global economy, there are a few things. One is trade and tariff policy. Obviously, the candidates have a different outlook when it comes to tariff. Former President Trump has been clear about his policy proposals to do sweeping tariffs. That matters to every country who is here today because they could potentially find themselves in an escalating trade friction with the United States next year. The other is who's the next Fed chair going to be? Jay Powell's term is up in May 2026. Obviously, the next president will get to select the next Fed chair. That matters for the strength of the dollar. That matters for the global economy. So people are paying attention here on the election for a range of reasons. I would say first, trade policy. Second, looking at the future of the dollar. And third, what does it mean for multilateralism more broadly? Will the U.S. be invested in these institutions going forward? The U.S. and the U.K. and Europe founded these institutions 80 years ago. What will the U.S. commitment be to the IMF and World Bank going forward? The election may be determinative of that going as well.
There are quite a few differences between the candidates, trade and tariff policy being one of them, but they do have overlaps, even though, let's say Donald Trump wants more broad-based tariffs, Kamala Harris wants more targeted ones, but neither of them really do seem to be advancing the trade liberalization agenda, so to speak. How do you think that could change the work of the IMF?
Well, certainly, trade is talked about very differently than even it was a decade ago. If you think of the presidential debate between Vice President Harris and former President Trump, tariffs started the debate and tariffs ended the debate. You wouldn't have seen that 10 years ago in a presidential debate in the United States and in most advanced economies around the world. It's reflective of what's happened over the past decade, the global pandemic, supply chain shocks, the realization that we may need to change our trade policies going forward in some way, and also a focus on industrial policies in the US and in Europe and the UK in a way they hadn't before. So what does that mean? It means that trade is front and center of the agenda. If you think of the managing director's curtain raiser speech, which she gave here a week ago, trade was the #1 priority. And that's very interesting for the IMF. The old joke about the IMF is IMF stands for it's mostly fiscal. That's not true anymore. Of course, fiscal is important, but trade is equally important now because trade frictions can cause inflation, they can cause destabilization of economies. So that is, and I think she correctly identified that, as a growing priority and concern, and you'll hear about it throughout the meetings this week.
Okay, finally, I have one more question. How should the global finance community be preparing for the next 4 years, no matter who becomes the US president?
Well, I think the way to think about it is these institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, are critical. If we didn't need them, we would have to invent them. Undersecretary of Treasury Jay Shambaugh was at the Atlantic Council last week. He said if there wasn't an IMF, there would be a giant IMF-shaped vacuum in the global economy. So the question is, what does every country do? Not just the US. We will determine our elections, we will determine our policy, but what does every country do to invest in these institutions going forward, to make sure they're fit for purpose? It's the 80th anniversary of these institutions. How does each country make sure it works for the next 80 years? It's not about what they did in the past, it's about what they'll do in the future. And I think every country in their own way has to understand what they put in and what they get out of multilateral economic policymaking.
Thank you very much, Josh Lipsky of the Atlantic Council.
Thank you.